So I'm Lois Donnelly. I'm interviewing Dr. Meg-John Barker on the 28th of February 2022 over Zoom. And we're discussing their life and career in the context of feminism and its history within psychology. So first of all then, could you tell me just a little bit about yourself and, maybe in terms of the trajectory of your career and the kind of topics of your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I started off with a psych degree and I wasn't at all planning to become an academic. I really didn't know what to do after, so I ended up doing a PhD. I really wanted to be a therapist from quite early on, but I was very young for that. So I did a little bit of therapy training and I was going to continue it. But I was looking for a job to fund it, and actually got a job at Cheltenham and Gloucester College of Higher Education, as it was back then, after my PhD, and then really enjoyed teaching psychology there. So I sort of was this sort of reluctant academic who kept finding my way back into academia, and then sort of stayed with that sort of, I just really enjoyed the pastoral side of the teaching. And then I got switched on to research once I sort of discovered sexuality activism and realized that you could research those kinds of topics. So at that point, I guess with my late 20s, I started studying the things that I'm more known for now, which is sexuality and gender and relationships, as a very much an activist academic, and then kind of continued that for sort of, I guess, till just a few years ago, when I quit and became self-employed. So now I'm a full-time writer, and I write like self-help style books and also graphic novels, which are about gender, sexuality, relationships, mental health. So those kinds of topics for a general audience, which has always been a kind of real, sort of love of mine, to kind of get these kind of ideas from feminism and psychology and everywhere else out to a general audience.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so interesting. So what kind of first, when you started on that kind of psychology journey then, what first kind of attracted you to the discipline?
Yeah, I think I've always been sort of on a journey of self-discovery, really. They always say that's sort of classic of people do a psychology degree because they want to understand themselves, and it really was that for me. Had been thinking about medicine, but it was when I went around the medical schools I was just interested in the behavioral bits, so I made that snap decision just to go for psychology because that's where I was really interested. But kind of like many psychology undergraduates, somewhat disappointed by what I actually ended up learning about. But I kind of continued that journey, really, of there was just a lot of suffering in my background, and really trying to make sense of that and going via psychology and then more towards sociology and, as I said, sort of different kinds of activism. Then I just trained in existential therapy, so that was trying to bring in the psychotherapy but also the philosophy of that. I've also studied Buddhism for some time, so it's always been this attempt to study different kinds of knowledge that really focus on human suffering and weave them together. And then my work is about how to sort of synthesize all of that in a way that can then be accessible to a general audience and give people the stuff that I found the most useful myself, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. So what was your kind of very early research on, because you said you kind of changed
a
little bit?
Yeah, so I did my degree at Nottingham University, which wasn't very critical. I was lucky enough to run across David Clarke, who was one of my PhD supervisors, who was a critical psych, but I didn't really get into critical psychology at that point. So it was a mixed methods, qualitative, quantitative PhD that I did about loneliness. And emotions have stayed a very key thing for me, but I wouldn't say it's certainly not how I would study loneliness now, so the PhD wasn't. It was really since then, it was after that, because I ended up really luckily, that first teaching job at Cheltenham and Gloucester, the Di Jones and Jonathan Elcock, who ran that department, were real critical psychologists with a real interest in the history of psychology. So that's where I got okay, there is this other way of seeing things that resonated much more with me.
Yeah, could you unpack that a little bit in terms of what you think maybe has changed in your work since then?
Yeah, I mean, really, honestly, when I started that PhD, it was just this kind of idea of psychology of you can ask questions about people and get answers. in this kind of transparent kind of way, really. Like, you ask people if they're lonely and they can tell you, and there was no sort of it wasn't very phenomenological, for example. It certainly wasn't very constructionist. So it was when I came across those kinds of understandings that it really shifted things. So it's much more about getting in deep at the lived experience, and also about the narratives that are available and how they impact people's ways of seeing the world and understanding themselves. So yeah, like I wasn't really exposed to those ideas enough until that first teaching position.
So that's more what kind of piqued your interest.
Yeah, I think I just didn't resonate with that sort of scientific empiricist kind of, I bought it until I was exposed to something different, but it was it just didn't really work again for me in terms of my own experience. So once I hit across feminist psychology, which we'll talk in a moment, but also social constructionism and narrative psychology and phenomenological psychology, those made a lot more sense to me in terms of resonating with my way of understanding the world.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. Yeah. So as you say, kind of at what point then along that journey did you start thinking about feminism, and how did that
into
it?
Well, it's great. Again, it's, I think, probably quite different from a lot of people's experiences, and maybe quite what people might assume about me, because I'm known to be sort of queer feminist now, but I was very normative, and again, personally, that came from having learned that I had to fit in order to get any kind of belonging or acceptance. So when I hit my degree, I was very much sort of gender normative, heteronormative, and feminism. Honestly thought back then, we've reached gender equality, like, what's this all about? Somebody bought me Simone de Beauvoir when I was 18, and I never even read it. So I was that psychology undergrad, and still through my PhD, and it was only that first, and so grateful to Jonathan Elcock, because basically there was a psychology of gender course back then at Cheltenham and Gloucester when I started, and Jonathan wasn't comfortable running it alone. Right. And wanted a co-tutor. I don't actually know where Jonathan's gender is now, and mine is different to what it was then, but there was an idea that having two people of different genders running that course would have been a good idea. Right. And so Jonathan encouraged me in to teach that. And so suddenly I had to teach feminist psychology. So I'm just reading it, over the summer, like going in September to teach it, and it's absolutely mind-blowing. I'm just learning all about like gender and how it works, and suddenly I'm a kind of very newbie feminist going like, whoa. This I suddenly see the world really differently. So that would have been like right after my PhD, so early 20s, and I didn't really look back from there. Like after that, it was feminist psychology and feminism much more broadly that really influenced me, and then increasingly queer thinking as well. Yeah, that's so interesting, because I suppose that's fairly late on in the journey, perhaps, in terms of PhD. And I feel like it's helpful for me in a lot of ways with my work that I had that very normative period. So I really have a sense of how painful normativity can be. I think, some people who've, always been radical or feminist or queer or all those things, it may be hard to know what's it actually like to live in those quite normative worlds and relationships and ways of being. And I feel that, a lot of my work's driven to say, normativity is bad for everyone. And I think that comes from that kind of lived experience, and also if I'm talking to people who are just not radical, not political, if I'm training therapists, for example, or, talking to everyday folk with my books, again, hopefully I have a bit of more of that sense of, what it's, where that, how to be heard, by that audience, even when you are saying those kinds of things, and how difficult it can be to hear when you're, so much in those cultures and systems, and just, are quite threatened maybe by anything that's questioning of them. Yeah, that's such an interesting point. Kind of know how that feels a little bit. Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. So, so that's really how kind of your work and feminism came together a little bit.
And so, yeah, at the same is that kind of when your feminist identity kind of grew at the same time then, do you think, kind of alongside
Yeah.
work?
Yeah, I think, yeah, so that I was at Cheltenham and Gloucester for a bit, which now I think is Gloucester University, and then at Worcester. And it was, you know, through that time that I became more and more like identified as a feminist. And then it was sort of towards the end of that time, so in my later 20s, that I became much more involved in activist communities. And that was particularly the bisexual community, polyamorous, you know, non-monogamous community, and kink community. And it was when I hit those scenes, I was actually often going in and doing workshops around, you know, feminism and bisexuality, or feminism and kink. So at that point, that was really a strong identity, and it was very much about bringing those worlds together. Like, you know, how can we do polyamory in a feminist way, or what are the intersections between feminism and bisexuality?
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I suppose, like, as you're talking about, yeah, that kind of work developing, as well as kind of your experience of that more normative stuff as well, how do you think your work was kind of, what was the reaction of maybe like the other people in your workplaces and so on to that kind of work?
Really different depending on where I was at, because I moved around a lot. I then went to London, but I worked in a couple of different places in London, and then eventually fetched up at the Open University. And like, I think psychology departments are just so different. So that experience I had in Cheltenham was, you know, really unusual. You know, I hadn't realized how unusual it was to have a department that was so critical, you know. And that was, you know, that was what they were teaching in Psych 101, was the history of psychology, and, you know, all the racism of IQ testing, and, you know, sort of problems with, you know. And so that was, you know, and then of course you go to a lot of other places, and actually most departments I think in the UK are just, you know, largely quantitative empiricists. Often you're the only qualitative, the only social constructionist, and it's wild because you have to like do like social constructionism 101, or explain why feminism is legitimate before you know, at the start of every slideshow, like, because, you know, if you're doing a presentation about your research to the rest of the department or the students. So different places had a really different vibe. And really different in terms of pressure. You know, I was so lucky to start at two really little colleges, you know, before they weren't, neither of them were actually universities when I was there. And you were just so free to just, you know, be interdisciplinary. I was teaching media studies at Worcester alongside a historian and a sociologist. You know, they were just such great places to, you know, support whatever I was doing and let me do, you know, my slightly strange, you know, kind of work. And then, yeah, when I ended up at the bigger London institutions, there was much more like pressure to be, you know, it was the RAE back then, you know, to be, referable or whatever, and, you know, to get funding and things. And it felt like by then my research did feel kind of weird and outsidery, rather than, you know, although there were some great critical psychologists and applied psychologists at those places too, but it was a bit more minority, a bit more mainstream psych. And then again, back to once I was at OU, different ball game again, because it was obviously really feminist psychologist kind of background in that department. So I just think it so depends, and people perhaps wouldn't know that. So it's really wise for, you know, junior academics to be aware of those kind of differences and maybe go to places that are explicitly critical. Otherwise you do end up having a bit of a hard time.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that's a really good point. Yeah. And so kind of on your journey then, did you have any mentors within all that? I think you mentioned your supervisor and stuff, but anyone key?
Yeah, it was a tough one. It's quite a sadness for me, because I think, not until quite late in the day, really. Like colleagues, absolutely, like some of the ones I've mentioned. But I think, you know, gender really played into it, because I do think a lot of the older male staff did used to focus on male students, like, you know, partly because of sexism, partly because of, you know, it being tricky, you know, gender dynamics or whatever, you know. So there was a real feeling like it was hard to get mentors. And then the kind of things that I was studying, you know, a lot of the feminist psychologists at that point who were older, and who studied sexualities and relationships were kind of lesbian feminist psychologists who sometimes weren't so great around bisexuality, around kink, polyamory. So, it was quite hard. And I was sad as well, because I think if I'd gone a bit more outside of my disciplines, if I had gone more into sociology, of course, there was, loads of stuff going on. And that was partly why I ended up at South Bank University, actually, because Jeffrey Weeks was there and there was a lot more going along. But again, that was a lot in sociology, and these departmental divisions are so sad, because, it really is quite hard to teach if you're in a bigger institution across disciplines. Like that just wasn't happening. You were in psychology, you were teaching psychology and researching with fellow psychologists. And I think the ref still makes it quite difficult to do real interdisciplinary work, which was always a bugbear of mine, because I was like, if I'm going to understand gender and sexuality, I need to know about the history, the sociology, the psychology, the biology, the stuff in English lit, the stuff in philosophy. It needs to be an interdisciplinary study. And I'm being quite like stuck in this, in psychology. So it really wasn't until I came to London around the age of 30, and that's when I joined what's now the psychology of sexualities section, but it was called the lesbian and gay section back then. Right. And back then it was Peter Hegarty was the chair, then there was Liz Peel and Victoria Clark on the committee, and then Darren Langridge. And they were all really important to me, but Darren was the one who was into kink and non-monogamous research as well. So we ended up writing a couple of books together, and I think he's probably the person I learned the most from, in terms of like learning how to edit books, learning how to write academic papers, that kind of thing, which was all like a bit alien to me. And Liz and Victoria very gently guided me through a process of writing a chapter for one of their books that I wrote a kind of polemic, and then they were like, this is how you could write it as a kind of psychology and researched psychology chapter instead. So those guys were really important. But really the first, I'd say, mentor in that classic way was Ros Gill, and that was even mid-30s, I think, where I feel like, Ros is someone I've learned so much from personally and professionally, who brings a kind of feminist ethics of care into everything she does, and who is interdisciplinary and intersectional, Ros is my main mentor, I think, in terms of feminist psychology.
Yeah. So as you say, that's quite late into the journey, I suppose. So kind of still having mentors throughout that journey. And nowadays as well, I would say, a lot of the people I learn the most from are the people who are junior to me. Sort of, I was thinking like, who do I really learn most from in terms of process and content? And it's mostly like trans feminist researchers like Ben Vincent, Ruth Pierce, Stephanie Davis, H. Howitt, and who are all like pretty junior. Some of them were just still doing PhDs or just out of them. And so again, there's something about questioning the mentor-mentee, sort of the elder junior. It's I really like to be learning from the people who've come before, but also the people who are coming after, who often have the much more radical ideas, or are familiar with theories that I haven't been, and that introduce me to those. That's so interesting. Absolutely. It's interesting that relationship, and I think it's really nice when it can be kind of both ways almost. Definitely. Okay. So and I suppose in the same vein then, do you kind of play a role as a mentor yourself, and kind of how important do you feel that is?
Well, it's really important to me. So I'm actually a writing mentor now, like because I'm a full-time writer. The self-employed work I do the odd little bit of training and sort of talks, but the main thing I do is mentoring people with their writing, and that's now very rarely academics. I'm up for mentoring the odd academic who's trying to get their stuff out to a more general audience, or do like zines and creative stuff, but mostly it's therapists and activists that I'm working with. But I've always really enjoyed my relationships with PhD students along the way. So I think mentorship's a pretty big thing for me. I'd always want to be doing it in one way or another.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, I suppose, like, do you feel that mentorship is particularly important in kind of the field that you're in and the work that you do more than others, or just
yeah, I suppose what I really like is being like somebody that people can come to, you know, who are more junior, who you know, do a lot of much more informal mentorship, I suppose.
Yeah.
Particularly in kind of trans and queer community, but yeah, people who are thinking about an academic career. I've actually also mentored a couple of people who wanted to get out of an academic career because they know that I've done it. You know, sort of, I've mentored people a bit about that around their gender journeys, you know, during particular big moments for them, you know, therapists who want to, yeah, so I just rather like that informal mentoring, or like really, like, now I'm a writer, like writing endorsements for people's books, you know, and helping them get them out there, or networking people I love, you know, when someone comes to me and says, can you do this? And it's like, well, no, I can't, but oh my God, have I got the perfect person for you, you know? So
yeah,
that kind of role, you know, that you might think of mentorship or being an elder a little bit, or, you know, a networker, yeah, that really appeals. It really feels like such a valuable part of, you know, what I do, and brings me a lot of joy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's so important.
Mm.
Yeah, so I suppose we've touched a bit on kind of your work and your journey, but I was wondering if you had kind of a particular accomplishment or something that you're really proud of that you'd like to kind of talk about as well.
Yeah, I think I picked two things for this that are a decade apart. So and they're two books, but they're a bit more than just books in a way. So 10 years ago, I published Rewriting the Rules, which was my first self-help style book, although I called it an anti-self-help book because it's very much a social constructionist kind of take on, you know, this is why the cultural norms around relationships are so bad for us, and this is how we might relate differently to relationships. And then I've just finished a book called Mad, a Graphic Guide, which is going to be one of my comic books, illustrated by Jules Scheel, on madness and mental health. And the first one, Rewriting the Rules, I've chosen, it took me 10 years to write that, and I was studying relationships from every different angle, and, you know, living them myself, very much trying lots of different relationship styles and having a lot of pain as well as some pleasure mixed in. And so it was a really hard personal journey, you know, that relationships had been super painful for me in all sorts of ways, and I really wanted to write a book that helped people to navigate them, you know, differently, and help them to understand how the cultural norms are really restrictive and often make our relationships very painful because of the kind of expectations and pressures we put on them. Yeah. And then the Mad Graphic Guide, similarly, it's more the journey that I'm proud of, you know, because since I went self-employed 3 years ago, and an awful lot of really tough stuff's happened in my life. I've been through a real kind of what would probably be labelled like PTSD the last 2 or 3 years. And I've read, you know, I've obviously already was pretty immersed in mental health, but I've read a lot of the trauma literatures and the sort of embodiment literatures. And this book is like me weaving together like everything I know from all these different places about mental health, but also really through my own lived experience of what's actually worked for me in terms of understandings and practices. So it feels like the courageous journey, you know, really in both cases was me like being up for looking at this quite, really painful and complicated stuff. And then the fact it's got this outcome that could connect with others and could be helpful to them on their journeys. That's why I find like deeply meaningful. You know, it should be enough that you've come through these things yourself. It is enough, you know, to do that. But it does mean a lot that I can say to myself, well, yes, it was really painful, but actually, you know, now this person's having a slightly easier time of it, or they've managed to access these really helpful ideas or practices a bit easier than I had it. I guess that's really always been what's motivated me. Like, this is so fucking hard. Could I make it slightly easier for the next person coming along, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's so lovely. And yeah, just kind of passing on again, kind of around that mentorship kind of thing, isn't it? About passing along knowledge and experience for the next person. Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, lovely. And so I suppose as you were kind of talking about that you'd kind of exited academia now,
Yeah.
how did you find that process, and kind of has that changed your perspective on psychology and feminism at all?
Oh, good question. Yeah. I think, I mean, I've seen a lot about academia that I think is, pretty toxic, and it's been easier to see it since leaving. And I've also noticed how some of those systems really operated through me, and how long it took, to detox from them in a way. The way I was treating myself as a self-employed person for the first year was similar to how I used to be treated and treat myself. And it's not specific to academia. A lot of that is just about any organization and the capitalism. Some of it is, about academia. Like, it's really opened my eyes to, just the assumptions behind research, and what kind of knowledges are valued, and what kind of practices are done, and how, what we think of as ethics, like with ethics committees and stuff, often really about legally covering people's back, but they're not really about what I think of as ethics, or the feminist ethics of care,
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I guess, a big thing is the last few years, trans people like me have been living through this really, really vexed time, particularly in feminism, but also everywhere, around how trans people are viewed and treated. So that necessarily has an impact on my relationship with feminism. I'm absolutely a feminist. And I'm in a feminism that has these really difficult rifts, which I've kind of always been familiar with, because obviously studying things like kink and bi, that already, they were on, I was, sort of coming in after the sex wars, but they were still very much in place, and finding myself positioned on that sex positive side of a polarization, which is actually not, I was often, all about like questioning that binary of those kind of polarizations. And and still am, but it becomes very binary and very polarized, as we've seen with the trans stuff. So so I have a complicated relationship with both academia and feminism, and psychology specifically.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I suppose kind of just acknowledging those differences within feminism itself as well is important. As we talk about that. Oh, brilliant. Okay, so sorry, I've asked you that question already. So you mentioned kind of that you were really interested in psychotherapy, and that you'd kind of maybe changed tack a little bit towards that during your kind of journey. How do you think your feminism kind of influenced that side of your work?
Yeah, big time. And again, you come across these tensions, because the psychotherapy world is just not very feminist, or very queer. So that's been a huge part of my sort of activism and engagement in the last decade, has been about, bringing psychotherapy together with, queerness and intersectional feminism. But I did train existentially in existential psychotherapy. So I found my way to Simone de Beauvoir after all those years, having got it for my 18th birthday and not read it.
Blowing the dust off.
It's like, whoa, what's this book? Because the existential psychotherapy training was largely, white man based. And I was like, but there is a woman. let's read her, and found her amazing, actually. I still think Simone de Beauvoir has so much to tell us. So I did my sort of dissertation or whatever for that MA around Simone de Beauvoir, and like I say, really a lot of the work since then has been about trying to bring gender and sexuality into, and race and disability and all of the intersections into therapy trainings, as more than an add-on. Some of them don't cover those things at all. Some of them cover them in, half-day extras. It's like, again, we need to like decolonize the curriculum. We need to think about the knowledges that are being taught as very similar to the psychology world, in that way.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, and as you were talking there about kind of your activism, then I feel like that's a really important part of kind of your work during academia and also outside of academia. And so can you tell me a bit more about that and kind of yeah, what kind of activism you get involved with?
Yeah. So as I say, like those early days around the age of the late 20s, early 30s, it was, the bisexual activism. And that's really where it was kind of really overlapping with kink and BDSM and with non-monogamous and polyamory. So that all of those, and it was sort of like the way I was looking at was like, oh, these are these ways of doing sexuality, gender, and relationships differently that seem to be really onto something. And again, always for me asking, like, what can we learn from the margins? What's happening here that everyone could learn from? And the sort of a frustration which I still have, that, you know, there's this sense that LGBT stuff is aimed at an LGBT audience, or, you know, polyamory stuff is aimed at a polyam, and I'm like, no, it's about our whole way of doing sexuality, gender, and relationships is really messed up in this culture, and let's look to the people who are doing it differently. Not that everyone should be kinky or polyamorous or bisexual, but that these ask the right questions, you know, that kind of everyone could be usefully asking. And then the activism, I guess, once I was in that psychology of sexuality section, I did a lot of activism via them, which was about like coming up with guidelines around gender and sexual and relationship diversity for psychologists who were practitioners. And later I wrote a similar resource for the BACP, which is the Counselling and Psychotherapy Organisation, and doing a lot of training to improve awareness and good practice for therapists. Nowadays, I guess, much more like intersectional feminism kind of informed. So I just kind of see all of the movements really as completely interconnected. And we have to be, you know, sort of doing activism for, like abolition and transformative justice and climate justice and disability justice and economic justice and decolonizing and questioning around borders and property. And, you know, like, it feels to me that those are absolutely interconnected. And again, we can't really do one without doing all of them, although some of us are going to obviously focus more on this bit or that bit. So I think, that's broadly my field, you know, of trying to bring all that together in my writing, and where I can, you know, trying to do that kind of activism, or, you know, involve myself in it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I suppose, do you feel like it's important that kind of academia in itself is more involved with activism, perhaps, than it is?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's not for everyone. You know, I sometimes think we need different people to have different focuses. You know, I was thinking about Judith Butler. It's like, you know, we need Judith Butler in the world. You know, that those ideas around gender are the most helpful, you know, or some of the most helpful ones we've got. And, you know, it's not so much so true these days, you know, because Judith Butler's doing much more kind of activism. But back in the day, when it was like really theoretical books, it's like, yeah, we need people doing the really theoretical books, and then we need people who are then translating those, you know, to maybe for students, and then you need people like me who are able to make the comic book version, and, you know, you need the people who are doing much more the activism, like out on the streets in terms of protests, you know, based on some of these ideas. So kind of like, I don't think people should have to be all things. So I don't think like every academic shouldn't have to be, you know, public facing, for example. I think that's really problematic, that everyone's expected to be on social media and doing all of this. If it's not their bag, just, you know, leave them alone. And similarly, like, you know, it may be more about informing other people who then do the more grassroots activism. But I do think, you know, academics should be very aware of the impact of what they're doing. And I think there's a lot to be thought about in terms of studying the other of whatever kind, you know, and I think that some of these trans conversations recently have only just touched the tip of the iceberg of that. But, you know, academia is entrenched in was entrenched in kind of colonialist and eugenics kind of projects early days, and we still have that flavour of, you know, people studying difference and, you know, pathologizing it, and, you know, coming up with all kinds of theories, you know, that aren't about the lived experience of the people concerned. So yeah, like, I'd like to see a lot more thought about that in academia.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And how have you found the kind of more public facing part of your work then?
That wasn't on the question list. I mean,
No. No, well, we don't have to touch on it if you don't want to.
No, I'm happy to. I've talked about it quite a lot. It's just, yes, it's not been entirely comfortable. Let's put it that way. Yeah, one of my earliest experiences, once I started doing this kind of research on bisexuality and polyamory and kink, I went to a BPS conference, and I was running the psychology of sexualities kind of thread, I guess, of that huge kind of BPS conference. And some of the journalists there got wind of my stuff on polyamory, and I had no idea that they'd be that interested. So I just went naively in and talked to like these 20 journalists about my paper, thinking it would be like, end of the newspaper, little cutout about the conference, tiny little bit about my research, and instead it was like page 2 and 3 of the Sun and the Times, and big picture of me, like headlines about me, my personal life. And it was, it is funny in retrospect, but it was really, really, really hard to go through, really traumatizing, in fact, and so like that's why I'm like, I am really passionate about being public in the sense of writing for a public audience, and I've done podcasts, and I've got a website and things like that, but I'm also really aware of how painful it is, and how so many feminist academics, their stuff gets taken up in really problematic ways by the media, and then often their institutions blame them, so they've got a double trauma of like they're being misrepresented all over the place, because journalists in the main do not care. They only care about a story, and they're going to weave it into the story they want to tell. They're not going to tell the real research. And then sometimes very junior feminist academics are then and then really unsupported by their institutions, because often the institutions don't really care about them as a person, they just care about their reputation. So that's a whole area that just needs a lot of work, I think.
Yeah, there's quite like a big tension there, I think. Yeah, okay, that's really interesting, thank you.
You're fine.
So yeah, we'll move on to kind of talking a bit more about POWES then. What has kind of been your involvement with POWES over the years?
So I mean, I could have got involved a lot earlier, actually, but as I said, that who I found when I got to London was the psychology of sexualities section, and I kind of stayed there. So I think maybe we had some joint stuff, perhaps even at that conference that I was just talking about. I think there were some joint things going on. There was always a sense that we were quite aligned, I think. There certainly wasn't that sense of like that there was a rift or anything, or that it was kind of, there was a lot of lesbian feminist stuff going on in the psychology of sexuality section, and there was certainly a sense of welcome from POWES, whoever, I can't even remember who it was back then, but there was overlap, right? But for me, I didn't really find my way towards it until I started at the Open University, which would have been about 2009. And I guess that department, the psychology department there, had this real history of people like Margie Weatherall and Wendy Holloway and Wendy Stainton Rogers and people who'd worked there. So POWES still had like a lot of there were groups of us who would go to POWES, and I think first or second year I was there, like Rose Capdevila and people like that, Gail Lewis, Lisa Lazard, were kind of like, come along to POWES. And so I did.
Oh, lovely. Yeah. And so did that become kind of a common conference that you'd go to?
That was my regular conference, I guess, even up until the pandemic. I think I went most years between. And just it felt just kinder than any other conference I've ever been to. You felt just really welcomed, really at home. I think it was just the feel of it. The content was great, obviously learning often, really interesting papers, but it was the vibe, and it was, I think something about all staying together at the, what's it called? A place?
Cumberland Lodge.
Cumberland Lodge, yeah, that just lovely atmosphere, and there'd always be like a comedian, you know, one night, and an 80s disco. The night I DJ'd the 80s disco, I realized I found my true calling in life. And I've not got to do it since, but I am the best 80s DJ you can possibly imagine. Like, someone had brought a playlist of all 80s, but they were just playing it through and it wasn't working. Like, no one was on dance floor. I'm like,
Right.
just let me, they're all dancing to this song. I know exactly the song to play next. Oh yes, absolutely. And just have a very, very good knowledge of 80s music and what will follow nicely. So so yeah, I just want to come back so I can do that again, to be honest.
Yeah, that's something to put on the CV.
Right. It was one of the high points of my life. But yeah, like, all my stuff was just so well received there, and yeah, just amazing people. I think for me as well, because I've got a northern background and a mixed class background, like coming across working class and northern feminist psychologists like Bridget Rickett, it was just really important to me. It's like finding a way to kind of bring those things together about myself, which I hadn't really come across so much elsewhere. So yeah, it was really big for me to make that contact with POWES, and it is a lot of the POWES people who've stayed in touch since, and found ways to bring me in to do other stuff. I'd say, and feminist academics in general, actually, it's the feminist sociologists and feminist psychologists who've really invited me back into academia to bring some of the stuff I do now, like zine making workshops and things, self-care workshops and stuff, and that has meant the world to me, that I'm not just like gone from that world, but people are still inviting me back and wanting to hear from the things I've been doing since.
Yeah, definitely. I suppose it's that idea of like that people outside of academia are also doing really important work that needs to be kind of shared as well at the same time. So so in terms of kind of, do you think you're involved with any other feminist organizations that are kind of comparable to POWES in any way?
Well, I suppose the really interesting one I was thinking about is there's a really quite new organization called the Feminist Gender Equality Network that has been set up. Sally Hines is one of the people behind it, and it's sort of explicitly kind of trans-inclusive and intersectional network for countering sexism and gender-based injustice. And it's worth looking at their website for the sort of list of things that they do, and that's quite an interesting comparison point for POWES, I think. But it differs, obviously, that it's cross-sector, so it's not even just academics, and it's interdisciplinary, and of course POWES can't really do those things. But I think the way it's very explicitly intersectional and also centering of diverse genders, those things, I think POWES is constantly thinking about, how can we be intersectional and how can we, center diverse genders. And those are, tricky issues in any feminist organization at the moment, but that would be the one I'd point to that I think's doing it pretty well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you have any kind of opinion on I don't know how POWES is doing on those kind of issues?
Well, I haven't been so involved, for the last, since the pandemic, really, and since leaving academia. So I really don't want to speak to how it is these days. But I think it's that, I'd say it's that what POWES does so well is that kindness and supportiveness and cooperation, and you're really in a kind of collective care kind of environment. While I was involved, I think what was done less well, but then I'm not sure anywhere is doing it very well, is having the more difficult conversations about, who does come here, are we making a venue, are we making is the organizational team diverse, are we making a space in which everyone feels comfortable, and when we're not, can we have those conversations, and how can we have those conversations in a really both a way that's both kind and gets things done, and it's really, really hard. It is really, really hard to have those conversations, but I think I was seeing those happening sometimes, but also not happening always when they needed to. Yeah,
that makes sense. Okay. And do you think, I suppose you've touched on it a little bit in terms of maybe meeting Bridget Rickett and thinking more about class and stuff. So do you think POWES has kind of impacted on your work?
Oh, hugely. Yeah, absolutely. So many of the things I've learned about have been through there. Yeah, and I think both actually POWES, interestingly, and the psychology of sexuality section have done pretty well on class. Not so well on race, but class. It's been really nice to see so many working class academics, and that's I've learned a lot from people who are exploring those intersections of gender and class and sexualities and class, explicitly in their work, and it's also coming from their kind of lived experience as well.
Yeah, that's important, having those. I think POWES maybe is a place where those conversations of kind of lived experience as well are happening.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, again, that's a good thing about it, that there's sort of it's not just the theory, like people usually are researching stuff they're passionate about and that does relate to their lived experience as well. And that there's no kind of thinking that there's no kind of psychology objectivity kind of, oh, you shouldn't be doing that, it's sort of really seen as a positive.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I suppose is different to some kind of more mainstream psychology sections or stuff like that. Yeah. So do you think that POWES has kind of developed over the years in any way that you've seen?
Yeah, well, I suppose the addition of the E was something that I was part of some of those conversations and I saw that come in. And I mean, I was sort of disappointed because I think really my vision was, why can we not bring together the psychology of sexuality and the gender psychology, as I see it, section. It feels strange to me, and it feels strange that the T is in psychology of sexuality rather than the gendery one. And for me, I just don't see gender and sexuality as really separable. I feel like under that kind of heteronormative matrix that Judith Butler talks about, it's like we're positioned as either male or female and as attracted to either males or females, and sexuality is seen all about the gender of attraction. So I just don't see those things as being something you can usefully tease apart into two different sections. And arguably you can't tease them apart either from race or class or disability or any of the other things. So maybe what I want is an intersectional psychology section.
That would be nice.
Certainly I just thought there'd be such a, why not bring these two together? They're both very small sections. They don't have a lot of power, but together they maybe could have. And there's so much overlap anyway between the people involved, or at least there was back in my day. So it was a little bit disappointing to me that POWES went down the, just adding the E rather than like becoming, psychology of sexuality and gender was sort of what my vision would have been.
I see. Yeah, that is, that's something quite different, I suppose. That's really interesting.
I can see where the worry about losing something would come from, though, because there is such a beautiful, kind of caring, kind ethos, and there are people who meet every year or twice a year, going on a retreats sometimes and things like that. And it's like, mixing it up could mean, that you lose some of that too. And there is a value to having small, really supportive spaces, and especially for, I know what my experience was like coming in and feeling so welcome and at home there when I haven't felt that in a lot of places over my life. And I think for younger academics coming in too, to have that experience. So it's always, you don't want to monkey with things too much, as well. I can get that.
And I suppose there's a bit of a tension between kind of being small and welcoming, and as well having power within the kind of the institution of PPS. There's a bit of a but so I don't know, this is quite a broad question, but do you think POWES will kind of develop differently in the future, or should it in any way, do you think?
I think just thinking a lot about how to have the difficult conversations, I suppose. I would really like to see that. And I suppose this is more internal. Yeah, so internal for POWES, I think the question is, how do we have the difficult conversations and how do we make sure that we're fully intersectional? And how do we do that practically in terms of memberships and in terms of venues and in terms of, maybe diversity of things that we put on, that kind of stuff. I think in terms of outward facing to psychology, again, I'd like to see a lot more focus on questioning things like the ref, questioning peer review, which I think is a lot of a very bullying system in a lot of ways, and not coming from an ethics of care. Questioning a lot of academic systems and really questioning which knowledges are valued, and how much it's dominated by sort of white male thinkers in psychology, and why there is that huge bias in terms of thinkers, and also how research is done and how research is valued. And I'd really like to think about the process more as well. And maybe this is in terms of the processes for how we communicate with each other, but also how we communicate with students and participants, is that there's so much about the sort of intellectual knowledge and so little about sort of embodied and emotional wisdom. And I've been reading a lot of someone called Beth Barilla, who's talking about contemplative pedagogy and how, if we're going to teach people or talk to people about really confronting subjects, like sexism and like climate change and like injustice, we need to help them, on an embodied level, like handle it. We don't have the emotional skills. We're not teaching the emotional skills. So people can say, oh, yeah, no, I get it. Or they can just get really defensive. But they don't know how to sit with, the pain of realizing, for example, that they're a survivor because what they've just read or what they've just been taught has revealed that, or realizing they're a perpetrator, or realizing they're part of a system of oppression that's really violent, or realizing stuff's going on in the world that they had no idea about, So it's like, I think should be a 50-50 balance of teaching intellectual stuff and teaching the embodied practices we need in order to handle that. And if you think about how conferences are structured, or how teaching is done, or how research papers are put across, there's none of it. Like, there's nothing. There's debates about trigger warnings. Nobody's putting a content note on their paper. Nobody's having opportunities to slow down and tune into the body. Like, conferences are just paper after paper after paper, even really nice ones like POWES. So I just love to see a lot more attention go to that, which again is so much of that's coming out of intersectional feminism. There's so much wisdom we could be drawing on, and the sort of therapy world can be helpful there to draw on as well, I'd say.
Yeah, it sounds like really interesting work.
Yeah.
So I suppose it's more about kind of critiquing the traditional ways of doing things, particularly within academia.
Yeah, that they were just, they were invented in a particular context, and we've just stayed with them, or we've tweaked them.
Yeah.
And, that context was one of colonialism, eugenics, it was like, women didn't have the vote, it's like, why have we stuck with something that was invented at such a time? I think it requires a lot more than tweaking. It really does require dismantling and starting from scratch with something different. And I'm not saying that POWES is going to be able to do that, but at least it could be maybe a bit more vocal in raising some of these, or in offering alternatives and offering to train people in those alternatives, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's really interesting. Lovely. So I suppose moving on to feminism and psychology more broadly, what kind of impact do you think feminists have had on psychology as a discipline?
Oh, I mean, still, I don't know, like, it's a while since I've read The Psychologist, but back when I did, like, not enough, still same old kind of conversations happening, so, but yeah, I mean, obviously there has been a huge impact in just this. I guess I see feminist psychologists as so central in critical psychology, in terms of creating this alternative psychology, which sees people very much as relational beings in a social context, they're massively embedded in, and also that people are embodied, and feminism has been so much about bringing in understandings about embodiment and affectivity you know, and doing research differently in terms of sort of ethics of care, qualitative research, you know, valuing lived experience. So yeah, it's both, isn't it? It's like a huge impact in terms of there is even this alternative whole way of doing things and whole way of thinking about things that largely comes from feminists, and very small impact in terms of, you know, there's mainstream psychology still going about doing its nonsense and still being the thing that gets reported, you know, mostly in the press, you know, sort of really basic behavioral kind of stuff often. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I suppose, do you have any kind of key ideas for what remains to be accomplished? I suppose we've touched on that in terms of kind of redoing those traditional systems.
Yeah, I think so. And then I think, you know, for all of us, really, we've got to turn the attention to these, you know, the massive ones that really impact us, you know, climate crisis, you know, continued, you know, injustice that's only getting bigger, polarization, you know, human conflict, like, and I think, yeah, feminist psychology has some really important stuff to say about all of those. That's where I'd be sort of facing mostly.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then I suppose my last question is, what advice would you give to kind of younger or more junior kind of feminists or activists entering psychology now?
I've written, the system is broken, not you. So if you come into psychology as a feminist or activist of some kind, and you experience a great deal of pain and suffering, then please don't individualize it, because what's happened is you've realized that there's a really toxic system in play of academia and psychology. And I think, you know, Sarah Ahmed's stuff's so good on this, about how easy it is to turn those tensions that you will have in against yourself, and actually, what you're not mad, you know, what you're seeing, or you are mad, but in the best way, because you're seeing what's broken and what's problematic here, and that it's really wise, if you can, to cultivate, like, you know, communities, you know, like joining POWES or Psychology of Sexuality section, or you know, more radical psychology networks, whoever you need, you know, to have a community where you can go and say this is happening, and everyone can say, yeah, that's a systemic and structural problem, and help you survive it. And also that there's a spectrum of possibilities between, you know, being an academic for life as a full-time career and, you know, not being. And so thinking about that as a spectrum, and whether you can have, you know, be not purely reliant on academia, but have other strings to your bow, or work across academia and other areas, especially because, you know, that I suppose that being some kind of an insider and outsider can be a more bearable place to be than being completely inside a system that's quite toxic. And also, like, you can feel a bit more like you've got a safety net as well, that there are other things you could do, you know, if, for example, you did have, you know, a tough experience of the, you know, press reporting your stuff, or social media, you know, which is a thing that happens.
And I suppose in that same vein, kind of focusing on the topic that you are passionate about, rather than the discipline and the system. But following what lights you up, you know, like, I think read Audre Lorde, you know, like that she's all on that, like, you know, what really lights you up, and, you know, there will be encouragements to, you know, just do what counts, you know, what gets the funding, you know, what gets the high scores on the ref. And I would say, from my perspective, you know, that there's a real danger in going down those roads, which is that you've got one life, you know, and you want to do what really lights you up, and that's going to be what connects with other people the most, you know. And you know, as much as you can, you know, recognizing, of course, you know, the material realities mean it can be very difficult not to, you know, try and fit those boxes, but finding your way with it, and again, finding sort of micro cultures of support who can help you navigate that. Absolutely. Okay, well, lovely. So is there anything else you think that we haven't covered that you'd like to touch on?
No, I think that's great. Yeah. Do you know, is there going to be another conference now that we're able to do these things, or where's that at?
Yeah, we've got I think that's the registration for it's opened, I think, now for the POWES conference this
Ah,
year. Yeah. And it's going to be in person, I believe. Yeah,
wow.
definitely in person or hybrid, but definitely there's an
Ah, that's great.
opportunity to go in person. So yeah, but I'm so looking forward to it.
Oh, I bet. Yeah. Oh, how lovely.
Yeah, it'll be really good. So hopefully that'll be, and then we've got the writing retreats up and running again as well. So
Yeah.
hopefully in April.
Oh, those have been so nice when I've been. Yeah,
Yeah,
brilliant.
those will be really good. But yeah, I think your graphic novels are like really cool. And
Thank
it's
you.
such an interesting kind of way to talk about your work.
Mm,
That's really great.
yeah, I love
Did you
them.
find it difficult kind of getting into that?
Well, it was just luck, honestly,
Mm.
that I'd done a little presentation about queer for the University of Birmingham. I think it was maybe a therapy training, but they just wanted a one-off lecture on what does queer mean. So I did them this little lecture, but they videoed it and put it up on YouTube. I didn't think about it again for about 5 years or something. And then Icon Books got in touch with me and said they wanted someone to write an introduction, to queer theory for their comic book introducing series.
Mm.
And because they'd seen that and thought I talked accessibly about it, did I want to do it? So it was
Oh,
just
cool.
so lucky, like if that
Yeah.
hadn't been there, they'd never have even known that was really my thing. And
Yeah.
yeah, it was. And then, of course, it went, it did incredibly well, like far better than most other books that I've published. And, again, no one had any idea that it would. And we've been able to do this whole series now, of which we're on
Mm.
the fourth one, and hopefully there'll be more.
Yeah, that's really nice. It's a nice little kind of
Yeah.
series, as you say, of
Yeah.
books. Yeah, definitely. Oh, lovely.
Mm.
Nice. So yeah, I suppose we'll just cover some demographics first for the
Yes.
record. So, so could you state your gender, please?
Yeah, I'm non-binary trans.
Lovely. Place and date of birth.
Hull. Um, and the 23rd of June 1974.
Lovely. And occupation.
Self-employed writer.
Lovely.